Had to be bigger so we could include the fellow on there. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But in accordance with what we've been studying on Wednesday night, I actually, after Joel's talking about on our Wednesday night class about stewardship and how that when you talk about stewardship, some people get a bad taste in their mouth because of the evangelistic health and wealth gospel, supposedly, that is promoted in the world. And sure enough, by the time that he starts mentioning that, I end up getting a letter from a Bible correspondence course student of mine. And here's something that was sent to him by a group that I've tried to get this fellow to realize is not us. It claims to be, of course, gospel-centered, but obviously it's not. And here's just a little bitty statement here of what he sent to me as evidence that things are fixing to get real good for him. He's a disabled veteran, and here's what the guy wrote to him. I have been assigned by God to help you so that you can receive God's answer to that special need in your life. Only God can meet this need, and he has put over 50 years of victory of this ministry behind you. Listen as I speak to you about these 7 secret prophetic events during the next few weeks. Through the help you receive from this ministry, God will move you towards a sudden release of money. In faith, I see this influx of money showered down upon you from an unexpected source. I really believe it is somewhere between $1,700 and $3,700. Now, you're talking about specific. I mean, that is just point blank, isn't it? Now, here's the problem with things like this. He has no direct connection with God. God's not telling him anything except what he's telling us all through his word. And here's a poor fella who's in destitute condition. The last letter that he sent me, he said, please pray for me that I will be relieved from the IRS. Okay? Wouldn't we all like that to happen, Well, I mean, here's a fella that's hurting. He's on a limited income, and he's needing help. And so he's sending and he's even sent me some of the receipts that he sent to this guy because he thinks it's going to be seed money. It's going to come back in abundance. Well, of course, it ain't going to happen. And so what is his attitude going to be when he's taken advantage of by these charlatans? He's not going to have anything to do with anybody that claims to be connected with the gospel because he's bought into the health and wealth gospel. But I just wanted you to know that that's not some obscure something that happened, but that's live and in person right here in this letter that I got from a correspondence course student out in Texas for sure. All right. We're talking about, of course, we know some of the things that we're going to try to illustrate and talk about in our lesson today. On Wednesday evening, I gave out 3 different articles, and the purpose for that was not so that everybody had all 3 articles, but everybody would have at least 1 article, and then when we brought these articles up here in a few minutes, then we'd be able to talk about them intelligently, at least as intelligently as we can. In regards to the subject of study. And of course, it goes right along with everything that we're studying in this particular class. When we say that dinosaurs and human beings lived during the same time frame, we're simply affirming what the Bible teaches occurred on day 5 and day 6 of creation. Since dinosaurs of the land living variety were created on the 6th day, and man later on the 6th day was created, then human beings and dinosaurs lived at the same time. And one of the articles that I handed out is going to be talking about that as well here in a few minutes. But just think about this rascal here. That is supposedly the largest, and of course there's a lot of discussion concerning the fossil record as to really which one was the biggest. Well, certainly this is one that is close to the biggest, if not the biggest, because this rascal here is 120 foot long, can get up to 120 foot long, and weigh between 70 to 100 tons. You would not want that thing stomping on you. You wouldn't even want him breathing on you, much less, because it would be terrible. But at the other end of the spectrum, you've got tons of small dinosaurs. And these small dinosaurs are, some of them, no bigger than a chicken. I like this one down at the bottom of the page here, Microraptor. He's obviously well named because he's a small raptor. He's a meat-eating animal, And I'd be careful if I tried to catch him like a chicken. He might take your leg off, or at least a finger or two. So all this expanse between huge and small were all created on the same day. But even those pale in comparison to this monstrous creature, the largest mammal in the world, the blue whale. Now, this blue whale can be 110 feet long and weigh 400,000 pounds. Its baby, when it's born, already weighs 200 pounds. And then it'll take in about that much sustenance every week as it continues to grow, trying to get as big as its mama. So we got this wide expanse of things that were created on days 5 and 6, and there's absolutely nothing that the so-called scientists present to us that contradict anything that God has revealed about the creation in Genesis chapter 1. Our specific point of concern in this study is concerning what he created last. And he looked upon what he created last and said it was very good. And we, of course, turn to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. God said, let us make man in our own image and after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over the cattle and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth on the earth. So God created man's own image, and the image of God created him, male and female created he them. So here we are, Adam and Eve, male and female, the first two. The first man was Adam. The first woman was Eve. The first female was Eve. And of course, Adam's name means man, which is certainly what we'd expect it to be. And Eve means life. And remember what Adam said about Eve in Genesis chapter 3 at verse 20. He called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. What does that mean? She is the mother of all living. Does that mean she is the mother of all animals? No. It means she's the mother of all other like she is, which is human being. So when the Bible affirms in the very first chapter, in the 3rd chapter, that Eve is the mother of all living, then we know for a fact that every one of us came from this beginning pair. That's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19. Have you not read that he that made them in the beginning made them male and female? What is he referring to? He's referring to what's recorded for us in Genesis chapter 2. He's talking about Adam and Eve being the first pair. Did Jesus have the authority to let us know the veracity, the truthfulness of what occurred in the beginning? Sure. Do we trust Jesus? Well, we better. But see, if we cannot accept what the Bible says in Genesis 1 through 11, then why will we accept what the Bible says about anything? Notice also as we continue reading in Genesis chapter 1, God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So here man was placed in the position of subduing the creation and having dominion over the creation. Now, sometimes man is very foolish in how he attempts to do that. And there's been a whole lot of people that thought they could tame wild animals that have ended up being killed or losing limbs or all types of other things. But God created man with the ability to actually do what he intended for him to do right here in the very beginning. The very reason why God created man was for that. Now, here's the thing. When God created man and placed him in the garden, then some people look back upon the history of mankind and they actually come to the conclusion that there's nothing really special about human beings. I think I've told you a few years ago, I remember watching a television program with Phil Donahue, and the title of that, and I think it was on the educational channel, it's probably on PBS out of Chattanooga, and it was called The Human Animal. You know, and I had a hard time because I knew that Phil Donahue was a Catholic, and yet here he was promoting the idea that man was nothing more than an educated ape. How does that jive? How does that go along with the biblical record to take the position that man is nothing more than an educated ape? There's a problem there. Well, one of the things that I handed out had to do with nitwits, or was the rest of the other word used? And one of the things that I handed out that you're supposed to be reading, ancient nitwits or knowledgeable ancestors. Okay? I'm not going to ask you if you got that one. There's about 20 that did. And so if you read that little old 3-page thing, would you consider that man is nothing more than an educated ape to be in harmony with what we know factually concerning the evidence as to man's position in the world? Or does man exhibit qualities of knowledge as not a knuckle-dragging, semi-human ape dragging himself through a cave somewhere? No. Human beings are something special. And why is it they're something special? Because God created them that way. They're not just uneducated, they're not just educated apes. And here's the distinction, obviously, that we need to be aware of, that God created man in his image. Now, what does that mean? Let's think about that. What does it mean that God created man in his image? Well, let's look at some things that we know it doesn't mean. We know it doesn't mean that God created man divine. Okay? Now, that's a problem to many people, because in rejecting what the Bible actually says about man's position, they go to the extreme of elevating man to the level of God. As a matter of fact, there's a whole lot of people in our world today that think just like that. And we're not talking about just the Hindus, obviously. The so-called 600 million gods of Hinduism believes that we're simply, if we're good when we come back, as we are reincarnated into some other animal and we keep on getting better and better and better and better, then we become God ourselves. Well, that's ludicrous, because we know that Paul affirms in Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27, it's appointed unto man once to die, and after this judgment. Not to die and then be born again, and to die and to be born again, and to die. No, that's not the idea at all. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why you don't eat cattle, even though you're starving to death, because you might be eating a grandpa or niece or something when you eat it. That's the ridiculous nature of Hinduism. But the New Age concept that's so prevalent in our society today buys into that same knowledge, into that same concept that man is really divine, that he is God himself. A number of years ago, there was a woman named Shirley MacLaine, and most of y'all, well, not most of you, but some of you remember her name, but she got into this transcendental meditation and yoga and all that bunch of stuff, and she wrote a number of different books. One of them was Out on a Limb. And in that book, Out on a Limb, here she says that she was talking to a fella who was an assistant in helping her to understand how godly she is. And this guy's name was Kevin Ryson, and he had this unique ability to channel people that lived long ago. And so he channeled, quote unquote, this fellow whose name was John, who actually lived during the days of Jesus. And here's what John supposedly told Shirley MacLaine. You are speaking with John. Your soul is a metaphor for God. You are God. You know you are divine. And then later on, after she wrote that book, she wrote another book called Dancing in the Light. And in that book, she says, I am God, because all energy is plugged into the same source. We are each aspects of that source. We are part of God. We are individualized reflections of God's source. God is us, and we are God. Now, when's the first time you ever remember hearing anything that was similar to that? It's in Genesis chapter 3. Remember? The serpent, the devil in the form of the serpent, said, God don't want you to eat of this forbidden fruit, because if you do, you'll become gods. So the whole source that we are divine, that we are on the same level as God, then that goes all the way back to Satan and the sin and the temptation of Eve and Adam in Genesis chapter 3. So there's a problem with that. And when you begin to look at the numerous examples throughout the Bible, then you see that you have good people people that the world would view as saints, like Paul and Barnabas. And when people tried to worship them, what'd they do? They said, get up. We're men just like you are. We're not deserving of worship. And in the book of Revelation, when you see people trying to bow down to angels, the angels say, get up. We're not God. We're created beings just like you are. So man, in the proper example, is not willing to accept worship because he knows he's not God. And yet we've got people who want to be God. And of course, when the end result of that is, of course, what we have in our day, if I'm God, then my truth is my truth and nobody else can say anything about it. And your truth, since you're God, then you can have your own truth too, and we can have all our own truth, and it can be contradictory as I'll get out, but it doesn't matter because I'm God and I can determine what truth is to me. Now that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. I was watching a debate yesterday, and this guy was trying to take issue with morality. He says people are brainwashed, and even with me and Tammy was listening to a video this morning in which sometimes Christians are accused of brainwashing their children. Brainwashing their children to believe in the Bible. How would you respond to that affirmation? Are we brainwashing our children? They're supposed to teach our children God's Word. One of the responsibilities that the children of Israel had was to teach their children the one true God of Israel, who had delivered them out of Egyptian bondage, let them walk across the Red Sea on dry ground, fed them for 40 years, provided them with clothes they could not wear out, shoes that never wore out for 40 years, to teach them about that God, and to do it in the morning, in the middle of the day, and at nighttime, to put it on their hearts, to write it on their walls, to put it on the doorpost and the letter. They were supposed to, in every way, teach their children to love God, to know who God is, and to do His bidding. That's our responsibility. Now here's the question. Reckon the atheist who denies that teach their children anything? Well, sure they do.
They teach them their belief system, you know, and there, again, we send our kids to school. We went to school. What do? We got taught math.
Yeah.
We got it drilled in their head.
Exactly.
Is that brainwashing? No, it's a practical knowledge skill that you need to know, just like you need to know God.
Exactly. And it's not, all it amounts to is you want your children to examine the evidence and based upon that evidence, draw a conclusion that's made necessary by the evidence. It so happens when you're studying in school, objective truth relative to math in a math class or a geometry class or a trigonometry class or an algebra class, then people see, oh, I can understand that objective truth there, but when it comes to spiritual matters and the existence of God, and they don't fit in that same category. Who said so? You know. For far too long, people have been hoodwinked into believing if they accept any such thing as the clarity with which the Bible informs us about our origin, then you are uneducated, a dummy, and living in the past. Well, it never has been so. Never has been so. And it's certainly not. You don't determine the truth by counting noses. Always remember that. If the truth was determined by how many people decided on it, then Noah and his little family of 8 would have drowned in the flood, and the ark would have had to be a whole lot bigger to hold all the infidels who really ended up perishing in the flood. You know, numbers don't make truth and right, and we have to understand that. So to take the position that when God said He's creating man in His own image, that means that God created man to be a God, then that's not the case at all. As a matter of fact, there's a good verse of Scripture I found from Ezekiel chapter 28 at verse 2, where God, through Ezekiel, is telling the king of Tyre, He says, here's the quotation, "You say, I am a God, and sit in the seat of gods, in the midst of the seas. Yet you are a man and not a God." Whoops. Well, I'm the king of Tyre. Well, so what? There's a king over here in Sidon too, and there's a king in all these countries here, and they're in their position of power, but they're not God. God is singular in nature. In Godhead 3, the Trinity, of course. And remember the classic example in the 12th chapter of the book of Acts when King Herod wanted to go on and present himself as if he was a god, and he ended up dying of worms and a very miserable death because he was trying to portray himself as being some type of deity. He wasn't. We're not deity either, you know. So when we talk about being made in the image of God, it's not talking about that we possess perfection as God does. There's a whole lot of difference between that and what is said here. The second thing, the description that man is creating God's image does not refer to his physical image. Now, why is that the case? Because God is a spirit, and a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. Now, believe it or not, there's a lot of confusion that has arisen down through the years over this very thing, and it may be because of our definition and understanding of the word image. As a matter of fact, there's a fellow that wrote a book. His name is Henry Morris, very good guy. A book he wrote was the Genesis record. It, of course, is the defense of the Genesis record, the creation of man, good book. But here's something he said in that book. And, of course, what he says here is reasonable to some people and accepted by some people. And here's a quotation. There is something about the human body, therefore, that is uniquely appropriate to God's manifestation of himself. He must have assigned man's body with this in mind. Accordingly, he designed it not like the animals, but with an erect posture, with an upward-gazing countenance, capable of facial expressions corresponding to emotional feelings, and with a brain and tongue capable of articulate symbolic speech. Now, that might be a tempting thing to say, you know, that makes pretty good sense, you know. But you still got the problem of God is outside of physical matter. He's not restricted by flesh and blood. He is in all places all at the same time. He possesses perfect knowledge, perfect justice, and he knows everything all at the same time. Now, when we see the Bible talking about God seeing things and having ears, remember the examples given in Isaiah chapter 59, verse 1 and 2, the Lord's hand is not shortened that he cannot save, nor his ear heavy that he cannot hear, but your iniquities have hid his face from you. So what is the purpose of that? Why would we have these different physical features that are similar to what we would associate with a human being and physical body? Why would we have that used in descriptive of God? So we can understand it better. So that we can realize that God takes in information just like we do, but that doesn't mean that he's got 2 ears, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, because that's physical. That's not spiritual. All that does is tells us he can observe what we're doing, he can respond to what we're doing, and that's all it does. The word is anthropomorphism, in which you take words that are associated with man and man's existence, and you use them and attribute them to God. Does God have an ear that's heavy? You know? Well, of course not. But that's illustrating the fact that man can relate to God and God can relate to man, even though God is a spirit. And you think about this idea of man walking erect. Well, is man the only animal that walks erect? Don't all birds sort of look like man walking? They got 2 feet and walk around with their head up in the air. So obviously that's not the concept at all. Man's posture is upright, but that has more reference not to the way that he walks, because I would have ceased being a man a long time ago because I can't walk upright, you see. And so if man's walking upright, in the book of Ecclesiastes, man, it was created to walk upright, as having reference to the value system that man is supposed to have. He's supposed to live in an upright way. Not necessarily that he's not bent over because he's got scoliosis or some back problem somewhere. Something entirely different. And, of course, one fellow made this observation: God, being incorporeal, in other words, he doesn't have a physical body, is neither perpendicular nor horizontal in his posture. He ain't got no posture. Now, it's impossible for us to comprehend God, who's in all places all at the same time, perfect mind, but that is what we have to understand. God's a spirit, and man does not look like God physically, but he does have the divine impression of God in him. That's why Jesus could go to the cross, being made in fashion as a man, and provide the sin offering for lost mankind. Also, think about this as well. Some would say that this has reference to something that was lost. Being created in the image of God was removed when man sinned. And so now no longer is man in the image of God. Well, of course, now if you're going to buy into the system of Calvinism, you might be led to approach that type of concept. Of course, it's not true, because they do damage to the very nature of Jesus and his sacrifice in behalf of us. When he was made in the likeness of man, and we are supposed to have the mind of Christ ourselves, who he was obedient unto death, even the death of the cross, and we're supposed to be obedient as well, even to the point that we give our lives for the cause of Christ. That loses its impact. It makes no sense whatsoever if man lost that divine image when he sinned. No. We still possess that being created in the image and in the likeness of God. And it's interesting that the two words there that are used interchangeably. It's not saying he created man in his image and after his likeness. No, it's actually he created man in his image and likeness. Same concept. Same words are used interchangeably throughout the Old Testament. The Hebrew word is. So the essential difference between man and the created animal kingdom is that man possesses a soul. Man possesses something that will live forever. Man has an entity to him. The essence of man is that he will be somewhere forever. And that, of course, is not referring to his physical self, because we return to the dust from which we were created. We go back into the form that God created man of the dust of the ground in the very beginning. But something about us will live forever. The rationality, the will, the emotional response. You think about the animals of the world. And I've used this question numerous times. Have you ever seen a dog who chased down a mama rabbit, and killed it, and then he went over and started crying because he'd made a bunch of orphan rabbits? That's never happened. Why not? Doesn't have a conscience. You know? Many animals are obviously it's so obvious they'll eat their own young if they're hungry. I mean, I've seen documentaries about sharks who, even in their mother's womb, will eat other sharks on the inside of their mama because they're going to eat. They got to eat. And some of them have a greater desire to do away with their brothers and sisters than others do. That's natural. That's the natural world. That's what God created animals to do. But mankind is not like that. So the distinction, obviously, is one that must be understood. We'll talk about that more later, because I got to get to the things that I put out. And when it comes to the matter of oughtness, think about this. You're on a boat, and all of a sudden out in the boat, you've been fishing all day, and you look, and there's an old man who's fell out of his boat, and he's drowning. And at the same time, your silly dog jumped out of your boat, and he's swimming in the opposite direction. You know your dog is old, and he's going to drown if you don't do something. Which one of those problems do you take care of? You can't do both of them. You've got to save the man's life. Now, I'm not saying that everybody would do that, but I guarantee they'll be held accountable eternally for making a dumb decision to save the dog. Well, heck, he's been my dog for 40 years. I don't care if he's been your dog since you was born. Exactly. And most people at one time understood that clearly. But sadly now, there's been people who have taken the position, and I'm talking about college professors, that if here you've got a nearly extinct animal, and you can save that nearly extinct animal, then you'll let thousands and thousands and millions of babies die just to save that near extinct animal. Because there's no difference between an animal and a human being. That's not what the Bible teaches. When it comes to the matter of what we ought to do, then we have to follow the direction that God has given to us. And of course, the reason why we make that observation is because of what is recorded for us here in Genesis chapter 9 after the flood. And Noah was told, him and his family were told to kill all the animals that were there. They could eat all these animals. They could eat seals, they could eat walruses, they could eat dinosaurs, they could eat rats, they could eat cats, they could eat dogs. So I said, whoa, 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 you can't eat that, cats and dogs. Well, yeah, you can. And if you're hungry enough, you probably will. But somebody says, well, wait a minute, that's not right to eat a domesticated animal. Well, aren't most cows domesticated? They're not running through the woods wild, are they? Do you eat hamburgers? I do. Not near enough. But I'd love to eat hamburgers. So we could eat anything. Now here comes the person that says, well, you got to be kind to animals. Well, you can be kind to animals, but you can still eat them too. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, remember, Paul warned that a time would come when people would believe a lie instead of the truth. They'd forbid to marry and forbid eating meats, and he says concerning their forbidden to eat meats that God created everything to be received by thanksgiving by them that believe and know the truth. So you can pray a prayer of thanksgiving when you sit down for your rat sandwich, because God created it where you can eat it. Wouldn't be very appetizing to even think about, obviously, but they have rat restaurants in Vietnam. I saw a video on it. And it's very interesting, make you sick at your stomach, but you can do it anyhow. And remember when we went and had one of the Olympics in South Korea, they had to go in beforehand, before all the foreigners got there, and get rid of their cat restaurants because they were eating cats. They really were. And that's exactly what they were doing in Haiti, and they brought that to the United States too. They're eating the cats. If you go to Haiti and you go into a food city or something similar in Haiti, then you've got skinned cats sitting in there next to the rest of the meat. It's right there. So to say they eat that, then that's that is simply being accurate. Okay? And then, of course, last one here. Excuse me. What is a man profit if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? That can't be said about the value of an animal. So he says, well, that animal, do you know that horse? That was a thoroughbred horse, and we paid $17 million for that thing. That's good, you know. That's valuable for what it can produce, and maybe win the Kentucky Derby and Preakness, and who knows what all else it can do. But no animal possesses a soul. One soul of a human being is worth more than the whole world. So that should have settled the matter once and for all. So when we thought about this article a few minutes ago, ancient nitwits or knowledgeable ancestors, what are some of the examples that particular article talked about as it relates to not nitwits, but pretty smart people? You think that the Egyptians were smart people? Do you know we still don't know how in the world they built the pyramids? Why is that? How come we don't know how in the world they put such monstrous piles of stone weighing tons and tons? We don't know how they did that. How did they do it? Because they were dumb? Or do they possess an ability that we still can't figure out? As smart as we claim to be, as computerized as our system is. Another example it gave in this lesson was the Mayans in South America. They had, this is over 1,000 years before astronomers found that the length of a year was precisely 365.2422 days. The Mayans now had calculated it to be 365.2420 days long. How did they do that? The Mayans had determined that a year was that long. How did they do that? They were good at math too. Reckon there was observation, Somebody says, you know what? Every year we see that thing right there in the sky. We don't see it before then. We see it. How were they able to do that? Exactly. Well, when you got here within close proximity to Adam and Eve, you got Cain's descendant named Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And Tubal-Cain, who was Jubal's half-brother, formed tools out of bronze and iron. Whoa. And we have, obviously, a big, long record of a pretty famous guy who had the unique ability to make a large floating vessel that we've got a replica of up in northern Kentucky. It's called the Ark. How did he do that? Obviously, he's dumb, very, very limited in intelligence to be able to do that. So do not, and even in the book of Job, another point that he made in this handout, in Job 28, it talks about our ancient ancestors being able to tunnel through rock and mining precious minerals from deep in the earth. How'd they get in there? They didn't have the big old jackhammers and stuff we got here today. How could they do that? How could they figure that out? Well, obviously their DNA was not messed up near as much as it's messed up today and taken away our ability to use our mental resources. What?
They had bigger brains, better brains, and less tools. We've got more tools and less brains.
And less brain. That's it. That's the distinction. And you think about it. Did they have any spare time? That's all they had was spare time. They were constantly. It wasn't that long ago that every summer, every spare minute, you were cutting down trees and chopping firewood so you wouldn't freeze to death in the wintertime. And you always tried to have an abundance so that you wouldn't see that the winter went on a little bit too long and you ended up freezing to death. No. That was all to make plans for and prioritize. What was a person going to sit down and read a comic book while his family starves to death and freezes to death? Of course not. So they made use of the time they had. They didn't have near as many entanglements with the world. The second article of some statistics that have been uncovered relative to those who buy into theistic evolution. What are some of the things that you would think would be a natural result if people believe that God didn't really create the world as he said he did in Genesis chapter 1, but actually it was created over eons and eons of time, and then God just put his stamp of approval on whatever we see, and so really the days of Genesis chapter 1 were billions of years long. What are some problems with that? Some practical problems. Made God a liar. Number one, if I can't believe what God said in Genesis chapter 1, why would you believe anything? I mean, if you can't believe it, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know, the interesting thing about that phrase, heavens and earth, in Genesis chapter 1, there's no Hebrew term for that. It's really a way of saying the universe. So you just think about that. God says, in the beginning, God created the universe. And then, in verse 2, the emphasis is on one part of that universe. It's where we live. You know, I encourage you to find a documentary, Apologetics Press, that says, why did we get all the good stuff? Why is it that the earth just happens to be in the right place so that we have all the things that are available to us? If we were a little bit further away from the sun, we'd all freeze to death. A little bit closer, we'd all burn to death. Why is it that everything just worked out so nice that we have all the fun things? We have water slides, and we can go fishing, and we can climb mountains. How did that happen? Boy, chance is wonderful, isn't it? Well, no, it's not chance. It's the way God created things. So if you can't believe what God said about one thing, why would you believe what God says about anything? And the point was made as well is that when people are convinced, and a number of years ago at Freddie Hardeman, Bert Thompson gave this lecture at Freddie Hardeman. He said, here's a kid, his first day of class, he goes into science class, and he sees the professor up there, and he's got on his lab coat, you know, and the student looks up there, and there's a Bible. He's got a Bible on his table. And so this kid who's raised in the church, raised by Christian principle, he says, oh man, this is great. He's got a Bible. And he says, he goes over there and he picks up that Bible, the professor does, and he said, if you believe this right here, and he threw it over in the corner into the garbage can. Whoops. Now what are you going to do? We're not going to be talking about this. We're going to be talking about evidence, scientific evidence. Pretty overwhelming. But he's not going to be talking about scientific evidence. He's going to be talking about a theory that is contrary to scientific evidence. He's going to be promoting a lie that he thinks is getting him off the hook where he won't have to meet his maker one day. That's what he's doing. And he's trying to deceive young people, young skulls full of mush, into buying into the lie of evolution. That's what he's doing. He don't want you to examine the evidence. Because there is no evidence for an ancient universe. There is no evidence for organic evolution. There is none. It's all a fanciful theory that has contributed to the lostness of far too many and has allowed many in the world to view the killing of their offspring as birth control. Amazing indeed. All right, what about the last one? When you've heard a lie 1,000 times, you have the tendency to believe it. Now, of course, the most serious example of this taking place was under the leadership of a man named Goebbels, who was the propaganda minister during the Nazi reign in Germany, because he actually said this, you know. If you keep saying the same thing over and over again, and you take what you're saying and you give it to this paper over here and they say it, and they give it to this paper over here and they say it, and you send it to this news outlet, this television program over here, and they say it, and you put it over there and they say it, and everybody's saying it, and it's in the magazines and they're all saying the same thing, then a lie ends up being accepted as true. And that didn't stop with Nazi Germany either.
Of course, today, you type it out, it's over the internet. You don't have to do that process, you just went through.
Exactly.
One person typed it, it's across the world.
Exactly.
Everybody's spread.
And there's the supposed proof right there. Hopefully I don't have to tell you this, but do not look to Wikipedia as being a source of truth, because it's not. It's not. The day in which we made jokes, well, I know it's true because I read it on the internet. That used to be a joke. Well, now people believe that's factual. If you read it on the internet, it's got to be true. No, it doesn't. I saw yesterday a guy down in South Alabama who was arrested for committing a crime in Fort Lauderdale because his picture had been matched up with AI. He never had been to that place, but he sat in jail. Reckon that'll happen more and more? They said it was 97% for sure that was him. Well, those 3% was significant. You know, the guy that was actually caught on camera had black wavy hair, and this guy had brown straight hair. But everything else was just a lie. Thank y'all.